At the Thanksgiving party, the millionaire dropped his glass of wine when he saw a waitress wearing a pendant identical to the one he gave his late wife, when she approached to clean the mess. Before we dive into the story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you won't miss the next stories. Stay tuned until the end, things are about to get intense. Now, let's get into it. The light drizzle outside cast a shimmery veil over the grand windows of Conrad Ashworth's sprawling mansion. From the outside, it stood as an architectural masterpiece, elegant columns, ivy-draped stone, and French doors that whispered of opulence. Inside, however, it was another story. Beneath the crystal chandeliers and velvet drapes, the house carried a silence that no amount of music or polite conversation could completely mask. Conrad stood in the study that overlooked the west garden, gripping a tumbler of brandy that had long since lost its appeal. The room, lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, was a space that once held warmth and life. Leather-bound tomes that had never been opened sat in pristine rows, reminders of his appetite for acquiring things that looked impressive but meant nothing. He loosened his tie, the crisp silk now feeling more like a noose than a piece of clothing. Sinking into the high-backed chair by the bay window, Conrad glanced at the reflection staring back at him from the dark glass. Time had etched its lines into his face, deep creases at the corners of his eyes, a furrowed brow that had become a permanent fixture. His dark hair, once thick and commanding, now bore streaks of silver that spoke of sleepless nights and years of grief. Yet his posture, even as he sat alone, remained impeccably straight, a habit drilled into him through decades of maintaining an air of authority. He pressed a hand to the side of his temple, closing his eyes for a moment. The image of Marianne, with her infectious laugh and eyes that could turn a mundane evening into something magical, surfaced unbidden. She had loved this room, curling up in the armchair with a novel, her presence filling it with life. Now it felt suffocating, a space that carried the weight of too many memories and not enough warmth. Conrad's mind drifted to how different things might have been if she were still here. If he hadn't pushed himself so hard, buried himself in mergers and acquisitions, deals that kept him at boardroom tables until the early hours of the morning. He often wondered if he'd missed signs, moments where life had whispered to him to slow down, to cherish what he had before it slipped away. But hindsight was a cruel teacher, one that came too late and offered no chance for redemption. His wealth, vast and immovable, had once seemed like a fortress against pain, an armor that kept vulnerability at bay. Yet here he was, the man with everything and nothing at the same time. The kind of power he wielded brought admiration and envy in equal measure, but not love, not the kind that softened edges and made life worth more than a ledger full of profits. Outside, the rain picked up, streaking the window and blurring the lights from the garden lanterns. Conrad sat there, unmoving, listening to the rhythmic patter as if it were speaking a truth he couldn't yet grasp. And beneath it all, the memory of Marianne's pendant flickered in his mind, a glimmer of something unresolved, something that told him not everything was lost. Conrad hosted the annual Thanksgiving party out of obligation, a tradition that had begun when Marianne was alive. Back then, it had been a celebration filled with warmth. Close friends gathered around a long table set with Marianne's handmade centerpieces, their laughter mixing with the crackle of the fireplace. But over time, what had once been an expression of joy became another well-rehearsed act. Maintaining the tradition was expected of him, a way to show the world that the great Conrad Ashworth remained as influential and steadfast as ever, even if behind closed doors, the cracks were beginning to show. The event itself was a spectacle, choreographed down to the last detail by his assistant, Henry, and a team of high-end planners. Guests swept into the mansion in a blur of tailored suits and glittering gowns, their voices mingling with the soft strains of a live quartet. Long tables were adorned with floral arrangements and flickering candles, their light casting elegant, shifting patterns on the marble floor. Servers moved seamlessly through the crowd, balancing trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres, their expressions professional and unreadable. Despite the luxury surrounding him, Conrad always felt detached, as though he were watching the scene through a pane of glass. The superficial exchanges, the practiced smiles, and the calculated toasts all melded into an indistinguishable hum. It was a performance that everyone seemed willing to partake in, and Conrad played his part well, maintaining his distant, polite facade. Yet every year, as the night drew on, the noise and grandeur only deepened the silence within him, serving as a reminder of the life he had lost and the emptiness he now carried. The room hummed with the polished din of conversation, punctuated by laughter that never quite reached the eyes of the guests. Servers, dressed in crisp white shirts and black ties, weaved through the crowd with practiced ease, balancing trays of sparkling champagne and hors d'oeuvres. The quartet played a gentle melody that filled the air, adding to the atmosphere of refined festivity. Conrad stood at the far end of the room, positioned near the grand fireplace with a glass of wine in hand, eyes sweeping over the gathering like a spectator instead of a host. He lifted the glass to his lips, the familiar burn of the drink offering a fleeting distraction from the restlessness gnawing at him. He was accustomed to watching the party unfold from a distance, his presence more symbolic than involved. But tonight, something tugged at the edges of his awareness, a shift in the room he couldn't quite place. It was then that his gaze landed on one of the servers, a young woman who had just emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of fresh champagne flutes. There was nothing immediately striking about her appearance. Her uniform was as plain as any of the others, her hair pulled back in a simple bun. But as she turned to serve a nearby guest, the light caught on a pendant resting just above her collarbone. Conrad's breath caught in his throat, his vision narrowing as he focused on the familiar piece of jewelry. The intricate design of leaves spiraling around a tiny, engraved heart was unmistakable. He had spent hours working with the jeweler on that pendant, creating something that embodied Marianne's love for nature and art. And after her death, it had disappeared, as though it had taken her memory with it. A sharp sting bit into his palm, and he realized he'd been gripping his glass too hard. The stem slipped from his fingers and shattered on the marble floor, the noise cutting through the room like a clap of thunder. Conversations faltered, heads turned, and for a moment, the bustling elegance of the evening paused. Conrad stood frozen, the echo of the glass splintering ringing in his ears, eyes locked on the pendant that seemed to shimmer with a story untold. Eleanor, startled by the commotion, looked up and found herself meeting the intense stare of the man everyone else regarded with a mixture of respect and trepidation. His blue-gray eyes, usually unreadable, blazed with an emotion she couldn't name. Quickly, she moved toward him, a practiced expression of concern on her face as she knelt to gather the glass shards. "I'm so sorry, sir. Let me handle this," she said, her voice soft but steady. She swept the fragments into the cloth she carried, working swiftly, aware of the weight of his gaze still on her. When she glanced up again, she saw him staring, not at her, but at the pendant that had slipped out from under her collar as she bent down. "Where did you get that?" His voice was low, more command than question. The intensity of his tone made her pause, fingers freezing over the last few shards of glass. Her heart fluttered uncomfortably as she registered the curiosity, and something else, in his expression. "This?" She touched the pendant lightly, a habitual gesture when she felt uncertain. "I've had it as long as I can remember. It was with me when I was brought to the orphanage," she replied, her eyes clouding for a moment as old memories she rarely dwelled on surfaced. Conrad's expression hardened, the edges of shock shifting to something more guarded. He nodded, as if that answered a question only he knew how to ask, but said nothing further. Eleanor finished collecting the broken glass and stood, clutching the folded cloth to her chest. The silence between them was strange, charged with an unspoken tension that made her shift her weight uneasily. "If there's nothing else, sir, I should get back to work," she said, hoping to break whatever spell had taken hold of the moment. He blinked, seeming to come back to himself, and nodded again, more slowly this time. "Yes. Of course." The words sounded clipped, forced, as if he had to remind himself to speak. He turned on his heel and walked away, disappearing into the shadowy corners of the room without another word. Eleanor watched him go, a shiver running down her spine, though the room was warm and crowded. She exhaled slowly, tucking the pendant back under her collar. The feel of it, cool against her skin, had always been comforting, a small mystery she carried with her like a secret. But now, under the scrutiny of a man who looked at it as if it held the key to something long lost, it felt heavier, as though it bore the weight of a story she hadn't yet uncovered. The hum of conversation resumed, the moment of disruption dissolving into the background noise of the party. Eleanor forced herself to move, to take up the tray of empty glasses and head back to the kitchen. But as she walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had just happened wasn't over. Something had shifted, a thread pulled loose that, if followed, might unravel more than she was prepared to face. Conrad, now in the solitude of his study, stared out at the rain that painted streaks across the window. His mind whirled with questions, memories that hadn't surfaced in years pressing against him with insistent force. The pendant had been Marianne's. There was no doubt about it. But how did this young woman come to possess it? And why did the sight of it stir a hope he hadn't dared to feel in 2 decades? He swallowed hard, the taste of old grief mingling with something sharper, possibility. The question that had been buried beneath years of loss now rose to the surface, demanding an answer. And for the first time in years, Conrad felt the certainty that his carefully controlled world was about to change. Eleanor's fingers moved over the glass shards with care, each fragment reflecting the glow of the chandelier above. She worked methodically, trying to tune out the feeling of eyes on her, the way the moment seemed stretched and taut. The rest of the room had resumed its rhythms, guests returning to their drinks and conversations, but she couldn't shake the sense that she was still under a spotlight. When she looked up, Conrad was staring at her, his expression unreadable but piercing enough to make her pulse quicken. "Where did you get that?" The question sliced through the noise, direct and demanding. His eyes, an intense shade of blue-gray, were locked onto the pendant resting against her collarbone. For a second, Eleanor felt trapped between curiosity and discomfort. "This?" Her hand rose instinctively, fingers brushing the silver pendant. The simple touch grounded her, reminded her of the countless times she'd reached for it during moments of uncertainty. "I don't really know. I've had it for as long as I can remember," she said, a small, polite smile lifting the corner of her mouth as if to ease whatever strange tension had settled between them. Conrad's jaw tightened imperceptibly, but he forced a thin smile, as if trying to mask the maelstrom beneath. "Interesting," he muttered, the word heavy with unspoken meaning. The edge of his voice was sharp, too sharp for what should have been an inconsequential interaction, and he seemed to realize it a moment too late. "Apologies if I startled you," he added, taking a step back, though his eyes lingered on the pendant for a heartbeat longer. "It's no trouble," Eleanor said softly, bending again to sweep up the last of the glass. She stole a glance at him, noticing how his usually controlled demeanor seemed strained, as if the air between them had shifted in a way he wasn't prepared for. To her, he had always been a figure from the periphery, the unapproachable man whose legacy was spoken of in hushed, respectful tones. But now, standing so close, he seemed less untouchable, more human, and conflicted. Conrad's thoughts churned as he forced himself to step away from the moment. His heart pounded with a rhythm that echoed the questions swirling in his mind. Every rational part of him urged caution, but there was a voice that whispered louder than the rest, insisting this was not coincidence. The pendant's intricate design, Marianne's design, was seared into his memory. Yet here it was, around the neck of a young woman he'd never met. It was both impossible and irrefutable. He cleared his throat, the sound startling even him. "Thank you, Eleanor," he said, his voice softening in an attempt to mask his restlessness. The way her name sounded on his lips felt unfamiliar, intimate in a way that made him uneasy. Eleanor blinked, surprised he knew her name. She hadn't expected that. Her curiosity flared, but she kept her features neutral, offering only a nod before retreating with the cloth-wrapped shards in hand. As she disappeared into the crowd, Conrad stood rooted, watching until she slipped into the hallway leading toward the kitchen. The room around him seemed suddenly louder, voices and music blending into an indistinct roar. He ran a hand over his face, trying to smooth away the expression he was sure betrayed too much. The pendulum of emotion swung wildly, confusion, hope, disbelief. Years had passed since Marianne's death, yet this moment felt as though it had stirred the ashes of old grief and breathed life into something fragile and unknown. Henry, ever the vigilant assistant, appeared by his side, brows furrowed in quiet concern. "Sir? Everything all right?" He kept his tone low, his eyes scanning Conrad's face for clues. Conrad forced a nod, though his hands were still trembling. "Yes, Henry." "Just a bit of a surprise," he said, his eyes still flickering to the spot where Eleanor had stood. The assistant's gaze followed, and Henry's expression shifted ever so slightly, but he knew better than to ask further. "If you need anything, I'll let you know," Conrad cut in, not unkindly but with a finality that sent Henry on his way. Alone again, Conrad turned back to the window, the night outside cloaked in rain that streaked like silver threads down the glass. The pendant was more than a simple heirloom, it was a piece of Marianne, a secret woven into silver and sentiment. He exhaled shakily, the weight of the mystery pressing on his chest like a stone. If Eleanor had truly had it all her life, then the timeline was clear. It reappeared years after Marianne's death, at a time that now felt suspiciously significant. The room, with all its warmth and glittering elegance, suddenly felt colder, charged with a challenge he wasn't sure he was ready to confront. In the kitchen, Eleanor leaned against the counter, her breath coming in quick bursts as she let the cloth-wrapped glass slip from her fingers. The pendant felt like ice against her skin, heavy and strange. She didn't know why Conrad's reaction had unsettled her, but she knew that whatever had just happened, it wasn't over. As the night wore on, Conrad found himself standing on the margins of conversations, his eyes drifting to Eleanor whenever she passed through the room. She moved with a quiet grace that seemed practiced but genuine, offering polite smiles to guests and blending seamlessly into the flow of the party. Yet, there were moments, small, fleeting ones, when her expression would shift, eyes clouding as if pulled inward by a memory or thought. Each time he noticed, something tightened in his chest, a pull he hadn't felt in years. The way she absent-mindedly tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the tilt of her head when she listened intently, each gesture stirred echoes of Marianne. He fought against the thought, telling himself it was nothing more than a cruel trick of the mind, a desperate connection forged out of longing. But the resemblance was undeniable, not just in the pendant but in the quiet determination Eleanor carried. From the other side of the room, Henry's watchful gaze met Conrad's, a subtle inquiry in the slight raise of his brows. Conrad gave a small nod, dismissing him for the night, and watched as his assistant wove his way through the guests toward the exit. The crowd was thinning now, conversations growing softer as people began to make their goodbyes. Still, Conrad lingered, his attention magnetized by the young woman who had unknowingly unraveled the careful seams of his composure. When the last guest departed and the music faded into the gentle clinking of glassware being cleared, Conrad approached the event manager, a woman named Sylvia who had been coordinating his gatherings for years. She was efficient, discreet, and knew the importance of keeping his inquiries private. "Sylvia," he said, voice steady but low, "I need a word." She paused mid-checklist, straightening with a smile that didn't reach her eyes but carried the polish of professionalism. "Of course, Mr. Ashworth. Is everything to your satisfaction?" "Yes, everything was fine. I wanted to ask about one of the servers. The young woman with dark hair, Eleanor, I believe." He caught the flicker of surprise in her eyes before she masked it. "Eleanor? She's relatively new to our team but has been nothing short of exemplary," Sylvia said, setting down her clipboard. "Did she do something wrong?" "No," Conrad said quickly, a touch too quickly. He cleared his throat. "Nothing like that. I'm just curious. Do you know anything about her background?" Sylvia hesitated, glancing around as if to ensure they weren't overheard. "I don't know much, but I did have her fill out some information when she started. She mentioned being adopted as a child. No known details about her birth parents, just that she was found and brought to a local orphanage when she was very young." The air felt heavier, pressing down on Conrad's chest. He nodded, lips pressed into a thin line. "Thank you, Sylvia. That's all I needed." "Of course, sir," she said, but he was already turning away, a flurry of thoughts racing through his mind. He made his way to the hallway that led to his private quarters, the echo of his footsteps mingling with the muted sounds of cleanup. Conrad stopped at the entrance of his study, hand lingering on the doorframe. His gaze swept over the room that had once been a refuge but now felt laden with questions. If Eleanor's story matched what he feared, what he hoped, then the mystery was more than a coincidence. It was a piece of Marianne's life he'd never known, a part of her story that refused to be buried with her. Conrad sank into the leather armchair by the window, the soft creak of the worn material a reminder of countless nights spent lost in thought. The rain had stopped, leaving streaks of water that caught the moonlight. He stared at the pattern, mind looping through the possibilities. Marianne had never mentioned any secrets, but she had always been fiercely protective, deeply compassionate. Was it so impossible to believe she'd kept something to herself? The idea of Eleanor being tied to Marianne in any way made his heart clench with an ache that felt like both loss and possibility. He traced the outline of his glass with a fingertip, replaying their brief conversation in his mind. The pendant, the way she'd spoken about it as if it were just a part of her life, ordinary yet cherished, it was more than a clue. It was the thread that bound her story to his, whether she knew it or not. He glanced at the old family photo on the desk, Marianne's bright eyes forever frozen in time. He whispered into the quiet, "What did you leave behind that I never found?" The question hovered in the room, unanswered but alive with potential. The study door creaked open, and Henry's head appeared around the edge, breaking the spell. "Sir, everything has been wrapped up for the evening. Would you like anything else before I leave?" "No, thank you, Henry. That will be all for tonight." Conrad's voice was even, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. As Henry nodded and stepped out, closing the door softly behind him, Conrad took a deep breath. His world, meticulously controlled for so long, was shifting, and for once, he didn't know if he was bracing for impact or ready to chase whatever truth the night had awakened. The rain had stopped, leaving a cool, misty calm that settled over the estate. The silence, once a balm for Conrad, now felt heavy, pressing against him as he stood in his study. The faint scent of the evening's festivities lingered in the air, mingling with the familiar, woody undertones of old books and leather-bound journals. He stared at the desk cluttered with paperweights and unused pens, fingers tapping restlessly on the surface as the weight of the night's revelation bore down on him. Conrad's eyes drifted to a wooden chest, tucked on the lowest shelf of the bookshelf. It was unremarkable in design, a plain oak box with brass hinges, but it held remnants of a life that once felt full and boundless. He knelt and pulled it out, the chest groaning in protest as he lifted the lid. Inside were stacks of letters, loose photographs, and Marianne's sketchbook, her creative refuge during rainy afternoons and quiet mornings. The sight of it struck him like a whispered memory, making his throat tighten. With deliberate care, he sifted through the items. He thumbed through pictures from happier days, Marianne laughing at a picnic, her eyes squinting against the sun, the two of them at a charity gala, his expression softened by her presence, a candid shot of her painting in their garden, hair in a messy bun, smudges of color on her cheek. Each photograph was a fragment, but none offered an answer. His fingers hesitated over an envelope tucked beneath the sketchbook. It was addressed to him in Marianne's handwriting, slanted and elegant. He hadn't seen it in years, the grief of her loss had made certain memories too sharp to touch. Slowly, he unfolded the letter, eyes tracing the familiar curves of ink. It wasn't a love note or a shared musing, it was a cryptic piece, referencing a friend she had been trying to help. No names, no details, just a line that stood out, asterisk, there are some things worth protecting, even in silence. Asterisk. A frown deepened the lines on his face. Marianne had always championed those in need, even if it meant keeping secrets. But what could she have been protecting that connected to a pendant he knew was uniquely hers? He shifted his focus to the sketchbook, thumbing through the pages filled with delicate ink drawings and watercolors. When he reached the middle, he paused. There it was, a sketch of the pendant. The leaves and tiny heart mirrored the one around Eleanor's neck. In the corner, Marianne had scribbled a note, asterisk, roots intertwined, secrets shared. Asterisk. Conrad's pulse quickened. The pendant's design had been personal, inspired by an old symbol Marianne cherished. She had once told him it represented connection, how people's lives could intersect in unexpected ways, forming bonds that were more enduring than they realized. He'd thought it a romantic notion, one that added charm to her unique spirit. But now, it felt like a clue, as if she had left breadcrumbs meant to be followed long after she was gone. He leaned back in the chair, the letter and sketchbook in hand. The pendant's reappearance was no coincidence. The details were too specific, too tied to Marianne's spirit to be an accident. The realization unsettled and invigorated him at once. It had been years since he felt the sharp edge of purpose cut through the fog of routine. For too long, he had accepted that the past was untouchable, that grief was a closed book he'd shelved away. But now, it opened, exposing chapters he hadn't known existed. Conrad's mind raced through the possibilities, each one more implausible yet compelling than the last. If Marianne had known about Eleanor, if she had arranged for the child to have the pendant, then it was more than a keepsake, it was a message. And if there was a message, it meant that Marianne's story didn't end the way he thought it had. The grandfather clock in the corner struck midnight, its chime reverberating through the room, a stark reminder of the time slipping by. The answer wasn't here, buried in memories and drawings. It was with Eleanor. He needed to understand why she wore that pendant, how she came to possess something that had vanished along with Marianne. But more than that, he needed to know if she was a part of the story he had never dared to imagine. He pushed the chest aside, leaving the open sketchbook on the desk as a silent declaration of what he intended to uncover. The light from the desk lamp cast shadows on the wall, shapes that flickered and shifted like echoes of the past. The note, with its message of silent protection, anchored his thoughts. Marianne's hand had written those words, words he hadn't understood until now. Conrad stood, resolve hardening his features. The questions that had simmered all night burned hotter, forging a path forward. There was no room for hesitation. He'd let too many years pass without answers. If Eleanor was tied to Marianne's final days, he would find out. And in that pursuit, the cold shell he had lived within for 20 years began to crack, letting in the first, tentative rays of something he hadn't felt in what seemed like a lifetime: hope. Conrad's office was a world apart from the rest of the house, a space defined by dark woods, shelves crammed with books, and the scent of aged paper and cedar. It was a room that spoke of power and isolation, a place where he'd made decisions that changed lives, including his own. Tonight, however, the space felt smaller, more intimate. A quiet tension filled the air as Eleanor stood near the doorway, her fingers brushing nervously against the hem of her uniform. "Thank you for coming, Eleanor," Conrad said, his voice softer than she'd expected. He gestured toward the chair opposite his desk, the invitation carrying an unspoken weight. Eleanor nodded, stepping forward and sinking into the seat. The room's dim light wrapped around them, accentuating the lines of worry etched across Conrad's face. It was the first time she'd been in this room, and she couldn't help but feel the significance of it. A rich mahogany desk separated them, but it was more than just a piece of furniture. It was the distance of generations, experiences, and now, an unexplained connection. "I wanted to thank you personally for your work during the event," Conrad began, eyes searching hers for any flicker of recognition. "But there's something else I need to discuss." Eleanor's gaze flickered with confusion. The pendant rested heavily around her neck, as if it, too, sensed the importance of this moment. "Of course, Mr. Ashworth. Is everything all right?" Without answering immediately, Conrad reached into the top drawer of his desk, pulling out an old, faded photograph. He turned it so that the image faced her and slid it across the desk. Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes widening as she took in the picture. A woman stood in a sunlit garden, her smile radiant, a familiar pendant glinting against her collarbone. Marianne. Eleanor's face paled, her fingers instinctively reaching up to touch the necklace she wore. She has the same pendant." Her voice trembled with disbelief, eyes darting back and forth between the photo and Conrad's serious expression. "Who is she?" Conrad swallowed, the tightness in his chest making it difficult to breathe. "Her name was Marianne. She was my wife." His voice caught on the word, the past pressing down like a weight. "And that pendant was made for her, years ago." The room fell silent, save for the faint ticking of the clock on the mantel. Eleanor's hand fell from the pendant, her brow furrowing as if piecing together a puzzle that had always been missing its corner pieces. "I've had this for as long as I can remember," she said quietly. "It's always been with me." The confession stirred something deeper in Conrad. "Do you know where it came from?" The question lingered, heavy with hope and dread. She shook her head, a rueful smile flickering and fading almost as quickly. "No. I was found outside a small train station when I was very young, maybe 2 or 3. The only thing I had with me was this necklace. I grew up in an orphanage just outside the city, but no one ever came forward to claim me. The pendant was the one thing I kept, even when everything else changed." Conrad's heart clenched, the timeline fitting together with almost cruel precision. The years after Marianne's death had been a blur of grief and unanswered questions, but now, it felt as if those missing pieces were assembling before his eyes. "How old are you now, Eleanor?" The question was gentle, but it held the weight of certainty. "I'm 21, she said, eyes meeting his, searching for understanding. The number struck him like a hammer. 21 years. The age aligned perfectly with the months following Marianne's sudden death. Memories flooded back, those strange, quiet suspicions, the feeling that Marianne had been troubled by something she hadn't shared. If she had indeed been helping a friend in distress, perhaps there had been more to the story, something that ended with this child, alone and forgotten. Eleanor's expression shifted as she processed his silence. "Why are you asking me this? What does it mean?" Her voice quivered, breaking through his reverie. Conrad took a breath, steadying himself. "It means there might be more to your story than you know." Marianne was a compassionate woman, always looking for ways to help others. "If she was connected to how you came to have that pendant, then there's a possibility you were more to her than a chance encounter." Eleanor's eyes filled with something fragile, a mixture of hope and disbelief. "But I don't remember her. I don't remember anything from that time." He nodded, understanding the magnitude of her uncertainty. "We might not have all the answers now, but it's a start. If you're willing, we can find out more together. There are records, places to look, and there's always a way to uncover the truth." The room seemed to exhale with them as Eleanor's expression softened. The silence that followed wasn't empty but rich with the shared realization that they were on the edge of something life-altering. For Conrad, it was a moment that cracked the shell of his solitude, letting in the first trace of light. And for Eleanor, it was the possibility that her past, once defined by questions, might finally be met with answers. The days following their conversation were a whirlwind of quiet determination. Conrad wasted no time contacting Thomas Hale, a private investigator whose reputation for thorough and discreet work was unmatched. Hale had solved intricate cases for some of the most powerful families in the city, and Conrad trusted him to navigate the delicate nature of this search. Within hours of their meeting, Hale set off to trace Eleanor's history, starting with the orphanage and the records of missing children from over 2 decades ago. Meanwhile, Conrad found himself drawn back into memories he had worked so hard to suppress. The house, with its echoes of the past, seemed to shift under the weight of rediscovery. He spent his nights combing through boxes and drawers, places that hadn't been touched in years. Letters, photographs, old notes, all were revisited with a new perspective. One evening, after hours of sifting through Marianne's belongings, Conrad found himself holding her leather-bound journal. The worn cover brought back images of her perched on their garden bench, scribbling with the sunlight in her hair. He hadn't had the heart to read it after she was gone, afraid of facing the rawness of her unfiltered thoughts. Now, it seemed like a lifeline. The journal's pages were filled with sketches, reflections, and musings on everything from art to the everyday joys she'd cherished. It was uniquely hers, a blend of deep insights and whimsical doodles. But as he turned the pages, his eyes caught on a note, hastily scrawled between passages. The ink had faded, but the words were clear. Anna is desperate. I promised to help her, but I must be careful. Some secrets need guarding, even from Conrad. Conrad's pulse quickened. He scanned the surrounding pages, looking for any mention of Anna or further clues, but found none. Who was Anna? What had Marianne promised, and why had she kept it from him? He flipped through the remaining entries, but the pages turned up nothing more significant. Frustration gnawed at him, but the realization was there, undeniable and solid. Marianne had been trying to protect someone, a woman named Anna, and whatever had happened had been too complex, too risky to share, even with him. Just as the implications of the hidden note settled in his mind, his phone buzzed on the desk, its vibration cutting through the silence. It was Hale. Conrad's throat tightened as he answered. Thomas? I found something, Hale said, his tone clipped but tinged with gravity. Eleanor's adoption records are sparse, but they're telling. She was indeed found at the train station, wrapped in a worn blanket, clutching that pendant as if it were the only thing she knew. No trace of her origins, no missing child reports that matched her description at the time. But there is one other thing. An anonymous donation to the orphanage appeared just a few days after she was found. A significant one. Conrad's grip on the phone tightened. Did you trace the source? It's murky. The donation was routed through a series of accounts, but I'm confident it originated from someone with means, someone who wanted to remain hidden. The pieces began to shift, arranging themselves into a portrait Conrad wasn't sure he was ready to see. Thank you, Thomas. Keep digging. I need to know more about this Anna mentioned in Marianne's journal. I'll look into it, Hale assured him before the call ended. The room fell silent again, the hum of unanswered questions vibrating in the air. Conrad placed the journal on the desk, the pages now a gateway into a chapter of Marianne's life he had never been privy to. If she had orchestrated Eleanor's safety, even indirectly, it meant there had been more to those last months than grief and confusion. Marianne's note spoke of a promise, one made out of compassion and secrecy. If she had known about Eleanor and taken steps to protect her, it made sense that the pendant, designed to hold meaning only she understood, would be the link between them. The next day, Conrad found himself tracing old memories. He returned to the garden where Marianne had loved to spend her afternoons, eyes catching on the familiar bench, now weathered and worn. He sat, the crisp morning air biting through his coat, and held the journal open on his lap. In the quiet of the garden, he read the note over and over, the words whispering of things unsaid and mysteries left behind. It wasn't long before Hale's next call came, days later but heavy with new information. Conrad, I found an Anna Carlyle. She worked at a nearby shelter back then, known for helping women in difficult situations. She disappeared around the time Marianne passed. A chill ran down Conrad's spine. Do we know what happened to her? No records after that period. It's as if she vanished, Hale said. But I did find a witness who remembers Anna staying at the shelter with a young child. They said she was always looking over her shoulder, as if expecting someone to come for them. Conrad's thoughts raced. If Anna had been protecting a child, Eleanor, it explained Marianne's involvement and the secrecy. It meant Marianne had helped hide them, at the cost of sharing her burden with him. The pendant, Eleanor's only possession, was proof of that connection. As the call ended, Conrad stared out at the horizon, the sun dipping low and painting the sky with hues of amber and gold. The path forward was clearer now, though not without its shadows. Marianne had protected Eleanor through her silence, a final act of love that reached beyond the years. And now, it was Conrad's turn to bring the truth into the light. The DNA test results arrived 2 weeks later, an envelope heavy with the weight of answers that could change everything. Conrad sat at his desk, fingers tracing the seal, heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The past weeks had been marked by stolen glances at Eleanor, moments filled with unspoken questions and tentative hope. He had watched her carry on with her work at the mansion, her expression calm but tinged with the same quiet anticipation that kept him awake at night. When Eleanor arrived at his office, she paused in the doorway, eyes flicking to the envelope on his desk. The room seemed to hold its breath as she stepped inside, closing the door softly behind her. Is that, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. Conrad nodded, the simple motion feeling monumental. He gestured to the chair opposite him, and she sat, fingers laced tightly in her lap. He opened the envelope with deliberate care, the sound of tearing paper loud in the silence. His eyes scanned the document, heart catching in his chest as he read the words that confirmed what he had dared to hope. Eleanor, he said, voice thick with emotion. He met her gaze, eyes damp as he placed the paper on the desk. It's true. You're my daughter. The words hung in the air, heavy and yet strangely freeing. Eleanor's face crumpled as the truth washed over her, tears welling up and spilling silently down her cheeks. The pendant at her neck glistened in the low light, catching the tremble of her hand as she reached for it. I always wondered, she whispered, the words breaking as she spoke. There were moments I felt like I belonged somewhere, to someone. But I never knew. Her voice trailed off, and she pressed a hand to her mouth to steady herself. Conrad stood, unable to stay behind the barrier of the desk any longer. He moved to her side, hesitant at first, but when she looked up, the shared understanding between them pulled him forward. He wrapped his arms around her, the embrace tentative but growing stronger as they both let go of years of searching, wondering, and silent longing. "I'm so sorry," Conrad said, his voice rough with guilt and relief. "I didn't know. After Marianne, after she died, I was lost. I missed so many signs." He pulled back just enough to see her face, the mix of her mother's features and something uniquely her own. Eleanor's eyes, still shimmering with tears, searched his, finding the rawness he had kept hidden for so long. "You couldn't have known," she said softly. "But now we do. That's what matters." Conrad nodded, a heavy breath escaping him as years of regret lifted, replaced by a warmth he hadn't felt in decades. "Marianne must have known," he said, more to himself than to her. "She was protecting you, even from me. It makes sense now, the journal entries, the pendant. She did everything she could to keep you safe." Eleanor's tears slowed, and she managed a small smile, one that hinted at the hope growing in her heart. "She must have loved deeply, to do what she did," she said, holding the pendant with a reverence she hadn't felt before. "She did," Conrad confirmed, his voice breaking slightly as he spoke. "And she would have loved you more than anything. I see so much of her in you." They sat in silence for a moment, letting the truth sink in and take root. The quiet between them was no longer the oppressive silence of uncertainty, but one filled with the unspoken promise of a future they would begin to rebuild together. Conrad took a deep breath, one that felt like his first in years. "There's so much I want to know about you, about your life," he said, breaking the silence. "And I hope you'll let me be part of it from now on." Eleanor's smile widened, tentative but real. "I'd like that," she said, a new steadiness in her voice. The loneliness she had carried for as long as she could remember seemed to shift, making room for something new, family. They sat together, Conrad holding on to the realization that he had not just found his daughter but had been given a second chance to be more than the man defined by loss. And Eleanor, no longer just the girl with a mysterious past, finally felt anchored by the knowledge that she belonged. The pendant between them gleamed in the light, no longer just a token of mystery but a symbol of the bond that had brought them back to each other after all these years. The mansion glowed with the warmth of golden light spilling from its tall windows. The usual grand Thanksgiving spectacle had been pared down to an intimate gathering, one that didn't rely on luxury but on something more profound. Conrad's heart swelled as he looked around the dining room, the table set with care but not ostentation. There were sprigs of autumn leaves, a modest centerpiece of candles and cranberries, and places set not for business associates but for the people who mattered. Eleanor stood at the edge of the room, taking it all in with eyes that shone. She wore a simple, soft blue dress that made her eyes brighter, mirroring the calm confidence she had begun to reclaim. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind, filled with quiet conversations and shared memories, some bittersweet, others unexpectedly joyful. And now, they stood at the beginning of something new, a family stitched together not just by fate, but by choice. "Ready?" Conrad asked, approaching her with a smile that was no longer just polite or practiced but genuine. His eyes held a softness that was as new to him as it was to her. Eleanor nodded, the familiar flutter of uncertainty replaced by a warmth that had found its home in her chest. "I've never felt more ready," she said, and the honesty in her voice settled between them like an unspoken promise. As they took their seats at the long wooden table, the small group of staff members who had worked at the estate for years exchanged knowing glances. Henry stood at the far end, his usually stoic face relaxed with a small smile that hinted at the depth of his relief. He had watched Conrad endure years of cold solitude, and seeing him share this moment was like witnessing a season change overnight. The meal began with the clinking of utensils and the hum of conversation. Eleanor shared stories from her time at the orphanage, anecdotes that were a blend of resilience and humor. Conrad listened intently, sometimes laughing, sometimes growing silent as he realized just how much he had missed. In return, he spoke of Mary Ann, not just in broad, sorrowful strokes, but in the small, cherished details that made her real. He told stories of her garden escapades, her spontaneous piano playing, and the way she'd always known how to lift the mood with an unexpected joke. "She would have loved you," he said to Eleanor, his voice steady but layered with emotion. "And she would have been so proud of the woman you've become." Eleanor's eyes misted, but she smiled through it. "I hope so. I've wondered about her my whole life. To hear about her like this, it means everything." Conrad reached across the table, their hands meeting briefly in a touch that spoke more than words ever could. The room seemed to pause around them, held in a moment of quiet understanding. As the meal wound down, Henry stood to clear his throat, a glint of anticipation in his eye. "I think there's a tradition that needs continuing," he said, lifting a glass filled with cider, the color deep and warm. Conrad's gaze shifted to him, caught off guard but pleasantly so. With a nod, Conrad rose, glass in hand. The room stilled, the small group leaning in with attention that was reverent and tender. "This Thanksgiving is unlike any I've had in years," he began, his voice strong, yet softened by emotion. "For so long, I thought I knew what loss was. I thought I understood how to survive it. But finding Eleanor has taught me that loss doesn't end with emptiness, it can end with rediscovery." Eleanor's eyes met his, shimmering with unspoken words. He took a breath, steadying himself before continuing. "To Mary Ann, who loved without reservation, protected more than I could have ever known. And to Eleanor, who carries that same spirit and has given me a chance to love again in a way I never thought possible." A tear slid down Eleanor's cheek, and she didn't brush it away. The room echoed with the soft clink of glasses being raised, staff and friends alike joining in the silent toast. The warmth that filled the room wasn't just from the fire crackling in the hearth, it was from the glow of connection, the mending of old wounds and the promise of new tomorrows. As they drank, the tension of the past weeks melted into a comforting ease. Laughter bubbled up again, stories flowed, and for the first time in decades, Conrad didn't feel like an observer in his own home. He was part of something vibrant and true, surrounded not by the trappings of wealth but by the wealth of belonging. Henry caught Eleanor's eye and lifted his glass in a subtle nod. She responded with a smile, one that said she knew she was where she was meant to be. The room, filled with familiar faces and new hope, felt alive with the echoes of what was and the quiet hum of what could be. As the evening turned to night, Conrad and Eleanor stood by the window, looking out at the estate bathed in the soft glow of lanterns. The sky was vast and clear, the stars appearing like tiny promises. "It's strange, isn't it?" Eleanor said, breaking the peaceful silence. "How life brings you back to where you're meant to be, even if the path isn't what you expect." Conrad nodded, a smile curving at the corner of his mouth. "Yes, it is. And sometimes, it takes the smallest spark, a piece of silver around someone's neck, to find what was missing all along." They stood together, two figures no longer defined by absence, but by a bond rediscovered. And as the night deepened, the house, once a place of echoes, finally felt whole.